All right. We are live, I believe. It is Sunday afternoon, May 17th, and this is a live review session for my students who are heading into the last exam of the semester. So for my hybrid students, that would be the Unit 3 exam. Students, that's the final exam. They're both the final exams, right? The last exam that you have to take for the semester. This exam is only on the material from Unit 3. It is not a cumulative exam, so you don't have to worry about studying all the stuff about human evolution from the beginning of the semester or cultural anthropology fieldwork methods or anything like that. We're just talking about the material since your last exam. So for all of my sections, that means linguistic anthropology, kinship and group structure, sex and gender, foragers, cultivation, ethnicity and race, and religion. Okay. So in these review sessions, I have been doing them on Friday evenings for the last couple of weeks, and I've been just going over like the new material for each week. This last Friday, I talked about religion, magic, and superstition, and I had intended to also talk about cultivation. As you, I'm sure, know by now, I have a tendency to go on a little bit about things that interest me, so I talked for way longer about religion than I had intended to. So I didn't get to talk about cultivation, which is what I thought I was going to do. So today, I want to talk about that cultivation material. And, this is obviously, it's geared towards the students like we are doing a particular job here, right? So I expect also, because in New York right now, it's a way to won't run into problems. Hopefully, a lot of my students are out finding a safe way to enjoy the sunshine and get some fresh air while remaining socially distant, still wearing masks, still doing all the things that we need to do to keep ourselves and our friends and our family safe. So that being said, you might hear some traffic noises from the background because I have my window open and I also live in the city. So let's see, a couple things that I want to remind you all of. As you know, I'm sending emails all the time now saying that like the exam is now online. So regardless of which section of my class you're in, your last exam is online. It is in the Unit 3 course content folder all the way at the bottom of the page. The exam went online yesterday and it will be due on May 23rd. So May 23rd is the big day when I have to have everything turned in. And that's because I have to submit grades to CUNY first on like May 27th. That only gives me a really short window of time that you want to turn in for credit by the 23rd. My computer is having some sort of internet problems. Hopefully this is not going to be affecting us terribly throughout today. Okay, so I need everything by May 23rd. Let's see what else. Also in the Unit 3 course content folder, so if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, that's where the last exam is. Just above that is the Departmental Assessment. I've talked about this in other emails, but just to refresh on that, the Departmental Assessment is essentially a tool. It's a 14-question, multiple choice question quiz, let's call it, about material from the entire semester. It is meant to be a tool for me and for my department to how effective I have been as your instructor this semester. So it is completely optional. You don't have to do it, but I would love if everyone in all of my classes does do the assessment. There is a review guide in the Unit 3 course content folder, just a couple items up from there. And it's essentially like, if you look through it, it's like a 14-page PDF that gives you like a quick snapshot review of a particular like chapter from the book, because the assessment is meant to kind of review the major concepts from the various chapters of the textbook. And this is assessment that was designed several years ago. So in some of my classes, we're not really using a textbook so much because we're using online materials. It doesn't matter. It's a very brief and like big major strokes sort of review. If you look through that review, it'll take you 15 minutes to go through everything. It'll take you 10 minutes to take the assessment. Okay, so don't use any notes when you're actually doing the assessment, but it's like the last thing to worry about and it's useful for me. But also, I will give you a half a point of extra credit for every question you get right on that assessment. So you could earn up to 7 points of extra credit for doing the assessment. So it's like a nice little cherry on top at the end of the semester, okay? The last thing that I want to alert you to is the fact that there is a study guide doing that. It's 4 pages long, which I know means that it's big and it's long and it could be overwhelming, but don't let it overwhelm you. This study guide is a list of all of the major concepts that we've discussed in Unit 3, and also a set of review questions about the material. Sometimes I see students like this, and they freak out thinking, oh my God, I have to know a definition for every single word on this page. And there is so much time and energy from, internet resources, and it's just like, just if I just write down all of the definitions, then I'm going to, that's going to be what studying is. And I don't think that's always the most effective way to study, because first of all, we have to deal with the reality that in this 4 pages of, of study guide, I can't possibly ask you about everything, right? The exam, depending on which class of mine you're in, it's hovering right around 40 questions. So I can't ask you about everything. We've just covered too much. What I would recommend is, get this study guide, but think about how these concepts fit together in bigger stories, in bigger pictures, okay? So for example, if we look at something like kinship and group structure, which is on the 2nd page. So I know trying to show you a piece of paper on YouTube is difficult, but for example, there are keywords like patrilocal, patrilineal, matrilocal, matrilineal. You could spend 20 minutes writing out definitions for each one of these things and coming up with very detailed examples, or, you could spend a lot of time thinking about these things as independent concepts. But it would be a lot easier for you to recognize that when we talk about how groups are organized and how families are organized within various cultures around the world, when we see the word local at the end of a word like patrilocal or matrilocal or neolocal, the local in that is telling us something about the location. And we also know that patri, and as in patrilocal or patrilineal, has something to do with men, right? It's coming from a Latin root. So patrilocal, men, location. Okay, well, a patrilocal society is one where the men in the family tend to stay together, right? And the women go live with their husbands' families. A matrilocal society would be one where women stay in the home or stay close to home and the men disperse. So it's essentially like, where do people live after they're married? With the husband's family or the wife's family? The same thing with patrilineal and matrilineal. The lineal part refers to a bloodline. So a patrilineal society is one where it's the male bloodline that's important. A matrilineal society is one where it's the female bloodline that's important. So just in understanding that local means location, patra means male, matra means female, we've defined 4 key terms without having to really think about it, okay? So think about how concepts fit together in terms of the bigger story. That would be my recommendation. Also, just as a point, everyone has their own way of studying. Everyone has their own style of studying. I can't tell you the best way for you to study, but I definitely would recommend thinking about your studying for this exam or any other exam you're taking this semester as sort of a long-term strategy, a long-term goal. And I say this as someone who, A, is a huge procrastinator myself, but B, had to learn a lot about how to study, especially once I got into college. And my first couple tries at studying for exams didn't always go so great, in large part because I thought I could do it all at once. It was sort of like, I got to take this exam in 12 hours. Well, that means I have 12 hours to study. It's like trying to learn everything at the very last minute. That's not a very effective way of studying because it doesn't give your brain any time to like digest and absorb and also just calm down and chill out, right? So I would say the ideal study strategy for everyone would be to attack the material in chunks. So, go over some certain chunk of material and then give your brain some rest, more than just like 5 minutes to get up and go to the bathroom or get a coffee. Give it a rest, like a couple hours or the next day, come back, review the material you've already done, and then tackle another section. The more often you repeat material, like the more often you are looking at things, and practice writing down answers. When you write things down rather than just reading them or typing them, your brain remembers it more. It's something about, like, I don't know, muscle memory. But it's easier for you to remember material and understand material if you're actually writing it down. Write things down in your own words and then just go over them repeatedly, okay? You're not going to be able to jam everything in last minute. So if you can spread out those efforts, you're going to ultimately be more successful. All right. So let's talk about cultivation, right? I wanted to go over the material from this lecture a little bit more because there is a lot of material that was covered, like a lot of important stuff. And that shows up on the exam as well. I have written the exam. I know what's on there. So I can tell you absolutely that cultivation features in some pretty big ways on the exam. Maybe we should start by answering the question, why in the world should we care about cultivation, right? Cultivation means producing food. So we're basically talking about how do people get their food in societies around the world, and how did those food systems start? Cultivation is a subsistence strategy. And when we say something is a subsistence strategy, we're really just talking about how do people get the things that they need? How do people support themselves and their families? And so in a previous lecture from the semester, we talked about foragers. Another term for foragers are hunter-gatherers. These are people who get all of their food from the wild, right? They hunt wild animals and they gather wild plants. Hunting is sort of our evolutionary heritage. Like, this is how early humans were evolving within their social systems, was to be hunter-gatherers. But then there came this shift 10 to 15,000 years ago where we start to see humans actually producing their own food. Rather than just getting food from the wild, they figured out ways to create food rather than waiting for it to sort of appear to them. And this is a fundamental shift in human prehistory, when humans start creating their own food, and it leads to a lot of other developments in human societies. Food and how people make a living is because food is one of those central needs that no human can live without. And so the ways in which people get their food and how they, the strategies that they use, the limitations and the affordances of their environment, that affects how they produce food and what types of foods. That is like the basis for which so many of our other cultural systems grow out of. We can't get away from food as humans. And certainly, if we think about how we define our cultures, if I were to ask you, like, tell me about your culture, probably one of the first couple of things that you tell me would be about the foods that you eat, right? What you eat on a regular basis, or what you eat for holidays, or what you eat for, like as religious observances. Food is this central part of human culture. And so understanding the ways that food production influences culture is going to be really important for us. Okay, so we've got, we mentioned we've got foragers, right, who get all of their food from the wild, but then we come into cultivation. There are three main types of cultivation that we discussed in our cultivation lecture. These are horticulture, agriculture, and pastoralism. Now, real briefly, we can sort of broad strokes define these three types of cultivation. Horticulture and agriculture are both about farming, but horticulture is small-scale farming. Agriculture is large-scale farming. And then pastoralism is, I'm just got distracted for a second. Pastoralism is tending to and herding domesticated animals. Okay, so like shepherds, people who shepherd animals throughout the year. The shift from foraging into horticulture is an important shift in human prehistory. And we'll talk about that in just a second, but let's define first, like the suite of sort of how horticulture works. So as we said, in their families, it's like I've got my house and then I have my little plot of land right there. And on that plot of land, lots of different types of foods, right? Maybe I'm growing corn and I'm growing pumpkin and I'm growing cassava and I'm growing whatever it is. I'm growing all of the foods that I need in that area. Because horticulture is small scale farming, it's done by hand. It's not something where you bring in, I see my connection keeps getting a little wonky. I don't know if that's affecting you guys. All right, I apologize if my video is cutting out for some reason. You all know how it is, internet in New York sometimes. Sometimes it's great, and most of the time it's not that awesome. Okay, so because horticulture is small scale farming, it's done by hand. It's people doing the labor, people in the family doing the labor, using really simple tools like hoes or digging sticks. Let's see what else. Okay, right. So using hoes and digging sticks. There are a couple strategies that horticultural groups use in terms of land management. One of them is called slash and burn. Slash and burn is pretty much exact sounds like. If you have a land that you want to grow some crops on, you have to first make sure that there's no other plants there. You want to clear the land from any pre-existing plants. The way to do that is to go in with something like a machete or panga or whatever and cut it all down and then just set it on fire. That does a couple of things. It cleans off all of that pre-existing plant life, but also when you burn organic materials like plants, it puts like fertilizer, like the nitrogen that comes from that burning process, infuses the soil or infuses whatever the substrate is that you're planting in. And so it puts in fertilizer into the soil to basically prepare it for your farming that you're about to do. So it's a good way of clearing and preparing the land. That's called slash and burn. Slash because you're cutting things down, burn because you're burning it. Another thing that horticulturalists will do is called letting fields lie fallow. This means that after you've been planting on a piece of land for a few years, after a while, this becomes depleted. The nutrients have been taken out by repeated planting. So at a certain point, the soil is not really good for planting any more crops. It's not rich anymore, and your crops aren't going to be as productive. So what you can do is simply transfer your energies to a new plot of land, use slash and burn to prepare that plot, and then plant over here. While you spend a few years planting over here, your original plot will start to kind of renew itself. So weeds will start to grow and then they'll decompose and that'll put nutrients into the soil. Rain will come in and nutrients from elsewhere. And so when you say you let fields lie fallow, it just means letting a plot of land rejuvenate for a few years, leaving it alone and not planting it while you farm somewhere else. And then when that one's depleted, then you can move back to the first one. So it's letting things rest so that they can be ready in a few years' time. Another interesting aspect when we look at horticulture in terms of how it actually plays out in people's lives, we know that within every society, the various genders have specific gender, there's like a gender division of labor, there are gender roles. So there are certain jobs that men do and certain jobs that women do, or at least we believe that men do, or we believe that women should do. What we see when we look at horticultural societies is that in about 50% of them, women are the primary farmers. So it's like a woman's job to do the planting of the crops and the harvesting of the crops and tending to them. And in 50%, men are the primary farmers. So it's split down the middle. Sometimes it's a woman's job, sometimes it's a man's job, and in some groups, anyone can do it. The interesting thing, though, is that in societies where men are the ones who are supposed to be the farmers, it's their job to do the planting of the crops, Being a successful farmer would be, it would have a lot of status attached to it. So it's like if you're the guy in the group who's got like the really nice cassavas or whatever, then that could raise your status within your community. It's a position that has prestige attached to it. But in societies where women are the primary farmers, there's not that same level of status attached to it. So if you're the lady who's got, the best maize, people aren't like, look at her, she's great at growing that maize, or she's fantastic at growing that millet. It's like, yeah, it's a woman's job, just like fetching water and doing laundry and taking care of the kids. So the exact same job, depending on who is expected to do it in that society, there will be different levels of prestige or status attached to it. So this is another reminder that gender informs a lot of how we assign value to various activities in the world. So sex and gender comes into our discussion of horticulture as well. Okay, so if horticulture is this small scale farming, then agriculture is large scale farming. Horticulture is done to feed your immediate family, or to feed your family and yourself. Agriculture is done to sell as a profit. It's when you plant a large area of land, often with a single crop, and then when you harvest it, it's not, all of that food is not coming into your household to eat. You're going to sell it to someone else, and then you use the money to buy the other resources you need. So if I'm a corn farmer, I'm not going to eat all of the 20 acres of corn that I harvest in a year, but I'm going to take that corn to a market. People are going to buy it from me. And then with that money, I'm going to buy my potatoes. I'm going to buy my soybeans. I'm going to buy lettuce, whatever it is. Okay. So agriculture is large scale farming. Because it's larger, it also requires more people. So more people means you also need more money, because you have to pay people to help you farm the land. You're not just relying on your family members. And also, what else? Agriculture typically uses some sort of machinery or animals to help till the land. So maybe it's a big tractor, or maybe it's a draft animal pulling a plow. It's not just farming by hand that you see in horticulture. Agriculture also has various land management strategies. One of these is irrigation. Irrigation means pulling water off of a river or off of a water source so that you can water more areas of land. So for example, if this is, hopefully this isn't too shiny. Okay. If this is that's a bad marker. Let's try this one more again. Okay. If this is my river right here, right? We know that plants need water in order to grow. So I can grow my crops right alongside of the river, but what if I've got farmland way down here? I want to grow stuff down here, but I can't get the water there. Well, using irrigation, I can just draw off, like I create a little man-made river, right? Or man-made stream, and I pull water off of that main river, and now I can farm all of this land over here. So irrigation just means getting water from the main waterway to other areas of land so that you can grow more stuff. The other land management strategy that's used in agriculture is called terracing, and this is my favorite. Okay. In order to be, a productive agriculturalist, you need to be planting on large areas of land. But the best type of land to be planting on, in terms of like how that landform is shaped, you really need like flat land, or at least relatively flat land. You don't want to try to grow acres and acres and acres of corn on the side of a mountain that has a really steep slope, especially if you're trying to use machinery or draft animals to, till the land or plow the land or harvest anything, right? If you have, let's say you've got a big hill like this, right? If you're trying to use a tractor, how do I draw a tractor? There's my tractor right there. If you're trying to use a tractor to go up and down this hillside, there's a very good chance you could just end up tumbling down to the bottom. And that's a very expensive mistake to make, right? You can ruin your tractor or ruin your draft animal. It's dangerous. It's not a good plan. So what agriculturalists typically want is some sort of flat space to grow their plants on. But most areas of the world are not completely flat. Most areas of the world have hills. So how do you deal with that? You do that through terracing. T-E-R-A. Terracing. With terracing, essentially what you're going to do is cut steps into the side of a hill, like this. So it's like man-made flat surfaces where now I can grow my crops right here on these steps, and they go all the way around the hill. So now I have a series of flat surfaces to grow my crops on, and they're really beautiful. This is something that happens a lot in East Asia, but it also, I've been told that it's a very common practice in parts of the Dominican Republic. So it's possible that you've seen this, you know, in your own experience without having to go to East Asia. It's just a way of modifying the land to better suit your purposes. And you can Google terracing and you'll see it almost looks like art in a way. It's a really beautiful way of dealing with the land. Okay, so having defined horticulture and agriculture, let's talk about how these systems of cultivation developed in the first place. So we know that prior to 15,000 years ago, all humans were foragers. They were hunter-gatherers, getting all of their food from the wild. These populations were typically pretty small, meaning you didn't have groups of like 10,000 foragers all moving around their landscape together, right? We're talking about relatively small bands of people. Each band of foragers tops out at about 100 to 150 people. So, you know, it's a good number of people, but it's not a large concentration of individuals on the landscape. So they were able to get enough food to provide for themselves and their family just based on what nature provided. From about, I'm going to give very rough ballpark figures. From about 30,000 years ago until 18,000 years ago, that's a period in Earth's history that we refer to as the last glacial maximum. This is the last time on Earth that there were really large glaciers covering a significant portion of the planet. This is like a last big ice age, you could say. And there were glaciers covering about the top 25% of the planet Earth. So for me in New York and all of the rest of us in New York, if we were sitting in the exact spots that we're sitting right now 20,000 years ago, we would have been under like a mile of ice. Those are the type of glaciers that we're talking about. Okay, so glaciers covered this whole area, and glaciers also, because they are these huge sheets of ice, they're sucking up water from, you know, lakes, rivers, ocean, whatever. They suck water into them, which means that ocean sea level that drops, and the atmosphere is also, sorry, not atmosphere. Let me say this again. When there is a glacial maximum, the Earth is typically cold and it's also dry, because when water is sucked up into glaciers, it means it's not being released into the atmosphere, and so the Earth in general is drier. The opposite of that would be an Earth that's warm and wet, and the Earth tends to move between these two modalities, cold and dry or warm and wet. So the last glacial maximum was this last period of maximum coolness and dryness. 15,000 years ago, though, the Earth had been coming out of the last glacial maximum, and the Earth was very warm and wet, just like we are today. We are in a warm and wet world. And because of human-induced climate change, we are going to continue making this world warmer and wetter. Our current problem today is that we're making it too warm and too wet too fast. And we can't keep up with the changes that we are instigating in the environment. But when it happens naturally, because of like the natural ebb and flow of climate, then species have a time to sort of react to it and to evolve and adapt in various ways. So 15,000 years ago, as the Earth was getting warmer and wetter coming out of the last glacial maximum, this was actually a really good time to be a forager. If you think about what a warm and a wet climate does, That promotes plant growth. So for, plant communities in the world 15,000 years ago, a warm and a wet world would have meant that plants could grow more. If you have more plants, then you tend to also have more animals. Animals like to eat plants. So when plants are doing well, animals are doing well. Then we think about the foragers who eat the plants and the animals. If suddenly there are more plants, there's also more animals, then foragers are going to have more resources. And this is exactly the scenario that we see in the Middle East around 15,000 years ago, 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, where suddenly there are, not overnight, but we have foragers living in an environment in the Middle East where there was an abundance of plants and an abundance of animals. And for people who were getting all of their food from the wild, this must have felt like, in my mind, this is an exaggeration, but in my mind, it must have felt like a 24-hour buffet. And so it's like every morning, like, all right, we should get some food. Where do you want to get the food? I don't know. It's right there. We don't have to work all that hard to get the food that we need, compared to a lot of other forager groups who have to constantly be nomadic in order to meet all of their dietary requirements throughout the year. Now, the Middle East, it's important to know, has 4 main environmental zones. And if you're wondering, as a student in my class, if it's important to know anything about these 4 major environmental zones, it's on your study guide, okay? You should have seen this diagram before with 1, 2, 3, 4 environmental zones. This represents elevation. So you have the low areas here and the high mountainy areas up here. So if you're not sure whether or not you should care about these 4 environmental zones, the fact that it's actually on your study guide might be a hint as you're studying as to whether or not it's important. So I'm going to recreate that little diagram here. All right, so we've got our low areas of elevation. Let's see if I can reduce this glare. Our low areas of elevation up into our mountain zones. I'm going to divide this into 4. Okay, now the reason why we care that there are 4 different environmental zones that are differentiated on the basis of elevation is because this means that there are going to be different plant and animal communities living each zone. So up here, this is a zone called the high plateau. Am I suddenly? Yes, okay, high plateau up top here. In the high plateau, we've got like mountain goats, boop, 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 and like little bushes and scrubby stuff. Next up, we've got the hilly flanks. And I would recommend knowing the full word. I should just write it out. High plateau. Okay. So next is the hilly flanks. Here we've got gazelle, which is like a type of deer. We've got trees. And we've also got wild grasses, like wild wheat and barley. Below that is a zone called the Piedmont steppe. This is the foothills. In the foothills, you've got more bushes with like, I don't know, nuts and fruits. You've got animals like rabbits. There's my little rabbit. Don't worry, you won't be asked to draw animals on this exam. And then at the very base, let me write it up here, we've got the alluvial desert. Oops, desert. Alluvial desert means it's like the place where it's a river valley where rivers that start up here as little streams, they become full-on rivers that kind of carve through this environment. Sometimes there will be floods. They flood that river valley. But you've got, and so because you've got water down here permanently, you've got like fish. That's a fish. You've got turtles. Okay. Okay. Beautiful. You can read all of that, I'm sure. With all of these different plant and animal communities, what this means for humans, for foragers, for hunter-gatherers living in this area of the world around, 13,000 years ago, this basically means that they can always get they can always get food. Like there's always food resources, right? There's going to be food resources in the winter, food resources in the summer, and there's a variety of food resources. So they can pretty easily move between these zones as they need to and get all of the food that they need. So if we were to think, like put ourselves in the position of foragers living in this part of the world 13,000 years ago, you've got all the food you could possibly need. What might you do? Like what decisions might you make about how to live your life? Well, we know that foragers are typically nomadic, meaning that they're constantly moving around their environment. The reason that they move around, it's not just because they really like to travel. It's not like, oh, we're going to summer over here and then spend our, people travel around because they're trying to get food resources. There's often not enough food in one place all year round to feed everyone in the community. But if you're living here, there is enough food to feed everyone all year long. And so our forager friends, for the very first time, they settled down. They started to become sedentary. Okay, so let me write that down here. Sedentary means to live a settled life in a village with homes all year long. It's the opposite of nomadic. And which zone did they do this in? It was right here in the hilly flanks. So I'm drawing a little house in the middle of the hilly flanks. So easily move into the Piedmont steppe and into the alluvial if they want those resources. And there were other resources, like just food scattered throughout these zones. So this is a strategic place to make best use of all of these resources. Also, you've got trees in the hilly flank nearby would probably be pretty useful. But the other really important feature of the hilly flanks were these naturally a little bit cluttered. But in the hilly flanks, you had the wild versions of plants today that we call wheat and barley. Wheat and barley are still major components of our diet as humans in the modern world. Wheat is in bread. Barley can also be in bread. You can also just eat barley, but it's also in beer, okay? So wheat and barley have remained important grains for the last 13,000 years. And it all started back here in the hilly flanks. That gives you kind of an indicator of how important this moment in time was. So we have foragers settling down in the hilly flanks for the first time, and they still were foragers. They were still just collecting resources from the wild, but they did so from the relative comfort of settled homes. Foragers lived in the hilly flanks for about 2,000 years, living this continual hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But after about 2,000 years, the climate started to change again. It started to get colder and drier, the way that the Earth always does. It's always vacillating, cold and dry, warm and wet, cold and dry, warm and wet. So as it's getting colder and drier, all of these food resources are now not as available as they had been previously. Okay? They weren't at the same level of abundance that these foragers had gotten used to in their sedentary villages for 2,000 years. Suddenly, if you have a constant supply of food, that means population size is also probably going to grow, because as food is more consistent, less people are facing starvation. There is less of a risk of disease sort of interacting with starvation. And so more people are surviving. And the more people survive, the more food you need. So you collect more food. They also started saving up food. They would collect these wild grains and then store them away for the next season or the next year to make sure they're stretching their resources throughout the entire year, which is something that traditional foragers can't do, right? If you're nomadic and you have to keep traveling all year long, you can't carry a 50-pound bag of rice on your back. That's too much work. It's just not gonna happen. So they're able to store food for the next year as well. But when the climate gets colder and drier, the food is less abundant, and suddenly there's not enough to feed everyone according to their traditional scheme. So what do? Do they go back to being foragers, like nomadic foragers? Probably not, because 2,000 years had passed where they were living in these settled villages. they wouldn't have had any cultural memory of how to be nomadic hunter-gatherers. So instead, they move into the Piedmont steppe, and it's here that the big revolution moment happens. Some people within these communities had the brilliant idea of what if we don't wait for the earth to give us food, right? What if we take some of these seeds of the wheat and the barley that we've been storing away for winter? What if we take those seeds and we put them in the ground? If I put the seeds in the ground, I think they might grow in the next season. And that's exactly what happened. So we have people in the Piedmont steppe planting crops for the first time. That is farming, right? The first farmers happening here in the Piedmont steppe, okay? And it comes as a result of some food scarcity after this period of abundance. So those are some early horticulturalists. And over the years, as humans intentionally were putting seeds into the ground, they also ended up doing this thing without realizing it was completely unintentional, but they ended up domesticating the plants that they were farming. Domestication refers to the process where humans have somehow altered the physical characteristics of plants in order to be more beneficial to humans themselves. So plants in the world, there are wild plants and domesticated plants. Wild plants are the ones that just grow without humans doing anything. They just grow, they're naturally available, cool. Domesticated plants are ones that humans have intentionally modified to better serve our purposes. So any domesticated plant used to be a wild plant, but then we've changed it over time. So for example, corn, because everyone knows corn. Corn originally started out as a wild plant, a wild grass in northern Mexico called teosinte. And I encourage you to Google teosinte because it's still around. You can still find teosinte if you go to northern Mexico. But it looks nothing like corn that we know today. It was just these little stalks with seeds, like 8. Then as humans would collect these little teos, as they would collect these seeds, they would save some to plant for the next year. And so if I have a bunch of seeds in my hand and I'm thinking about what I'm going to plant for next year, I've got some seeds that are bigger and some seeds that are smaller. Which ones should I put in the ground for next year? The big ones, because that means that what grows next year is going to be bigger seeds. If seeds are the thing that I'm eating, then I want bigger versions of that because that will mean more food. Or, maybe some of my little teosinte plants have 10 seeds on them rather than 8, or 16 seeds rather than 8, or some of them are kind of doubled up. Well, I'm going to plant the one for next year that has more on it because then that's going to be the thing that grows. So humans, they were intentionally planting the seeds of plants that they found more beneficial. But when this happens generation after generation, you end up with a really big physical difference between the original wild plant and the things that humans end up planting. That division is called domestication. Most of the plants that we eat as part of our diet today have been domesticated because we've modified them in some way to make them bigger, tastier, more nutritious for us. We've done the same thing with animals as well. Humans multiple times have taken wild animals or interacted with wild animals. We've sort of brought them into our sphere. And through repeated generations of saving the animals that had good characteristics and kind of pushing away the animals that had bad characteristics, we've changed their genetic codes from being wild into being animals that can have this more symbiotic relationship with humans, meaning that our lives are mutually beneficial for being enmeshed. We give them something, they give us something. Dogs are probably the first domesticated animal. It's thought by a lot of people that dogs were domesticated maybe 20,000 years ago, maybe a little bit more, in Europe by some of these early human migrants into Europe. If we think about, what benefit do dogs have? I mean, obviously today we love dogs and they're very cute, but our dogs today are very different from those wild dog ancestors, also known as wolves. Wolves are fierce. Wolves will mess you up, right? It's not recommended for most of us to have a close interaction with wolves. But if we think about some of these early human groups about 20,000 years ago, or maybe earlier, these are people that throughout Europe were, often exploiting like rock shelters and caves. We talk about cavemen. That's kind of who we're talking about. Being a hunter-gatherer 20,000 years ago in Europe, if you're bringing your animal kills, so bringing the dead animals that you've hunted back into your cave, that's a good way to be sheltered from the elements and to protect yourself from the cold, to protect yourself in some ways from predators. But you also, just by having this animal carcass in your cave, there are going to be predators that are going to be attracted by smell, right? So it's kind of like having a dead animal carcass in your cave is sort of an invitation to animals like bears and wolves. But it's hypothesized that wolves 20,000 years ago, at least some of them, kind of started to figure out that there could be some benefit to not attacking humans in their caves when they're eating their dead animals. So for humans, if we're carving up a big, let's say we hunted a moose or something. Do moose even live in Europe? Reindeer. Let's say reindeer. I know they live there. Okay, so I've got a reindeer kill. I'm in my cave with my other caveman buds. I don't want to keep the dead animal bones in my cave after we're done eating. So I'm going to throw those bones. Hey, listen, Mary. We're going to throw those bones outside of the cave so that bears don't come in and get us, and so that wolves don't come in and get us. But somewhere along the way, some wolves realize, like, hey, if we just don't attack those humans and we just camp out here outside the cave every day, they'll just keep throwing us bones. So we don't even have to work for it. We'll just sit here and they'll continue to give us food. And then the humans go, oh, you know what? As long as we continue throwing those wolves our bones that we don't eat, they stay out there and they don't bother us. And the extra benefit is that when there are wolves out in front of our cave, the bears never come by, because the wolves are like, here's our food source. Hey, bears, stay away from our food. So now the wolves aren't bothering us. The bears aren't bothering us. They're just hanging out over there. And as long as we keep throwing them stuff, everyone's happy. And then, of course, baby wolves are born and they're super cute, just the way all baby things are cute. And so maybe some of those baby wolves were like a little bit more curious and they'd sort of teeter up to the cave edge and humans would say, hey, little baby wolf. Those wolves that would be born that were a little bit more receptive to human interaction, maybe those wolves would slowly get incorporated into the daily lives of those humans. And generation after generation, those wolves that were a little bit less wolfy and a little bit more chill were the ones that humans continued to support and continue to take care of in their lives, until eventually those wild, fierce wolves turn into the human companion of dogs that we think of today. So domestication is a long process. It happens over generations, but it's where humans change the physical or behavioral characteristics of plants and animals to better suit our own purposes. Whew. Okay. Oh, one other thing. Just because I know it's on your study guide, one of these groups of foragers who lived here in the hilly flanks in the Middle East, who were these sedentary hunter-gatherers, a group of people that we call the Natufians. Okay, Natufians. And I'm not going to talk about them too much here, but you can go back to the lecture video or just look at some other videos on YouTube about the Natufians. They were a cool and weird group of people. Their burial practices were especially interesting. And we don't really know what happened to them. They existed in the Middle East, like in Israel, for about 2,000 years, and then they just kind of disappeared. But they were some of the early sedentary hunter-gatherers in the Middle East. Okay, I don't want to ignore this other comment, Noah Abraham. Thank you very much for being here. I hope you're enjoying this as well. And all of the rest of you who aren't saying anything, but just chilling and sort of letting this seep in, I hope you know I see you and I appreciate you. I'm glad that you're here. Okay, so now, the last cultivation thing that we need to talk about is pastoralism, right? We've covered horticulture, covered agriculture. Pastoralism is tending to and herding domesticated animals. We're talking about professional shepherds, people who take care of herds of animals. Those animals end up being like the wealth of a person, essentially. Pastoralists are often nomadic because we know that just like humans, animals have to eat. And if you are tending to a herd of animals, they're likely going to be, hi Fanta, good to see you too. If we're talking about groups of animals that are being herded, sorry. Oh, you can tell it's the end of the semester because my brain and my mouth aren't necessarily working in sync together. Okay, let me rewind. Pastoralists tend to domesticated animals. Another word about domesticated animals, they're primarily herbivores, right? They're plant-eating animals. I can't really think, aside from cats and dogs, I can't think of another domesticated animal that is a meat eater. And cats and dogs are kind of like weird exceptions to the rule. But all of our other domesticated animals are plant eaters. Cows, camels, goats, sheep, horses, pigs, chickens, turkeys, llamas, alpacas, guinea pigs. What are other domesticated animals? Reindeer are semi-domesticated. Yeah. Herbivores, often they live in herds, right? Big packs of animals. But the thing about domestication is that those herd structures have to have some sort of hierarchy system. So if you look at even like a herd of wild buffalo, there's going to be like kind of the alpha buffalo, right? The buffalo that's sort of in charge of all of the other buffalo. The reason why that internal hierarchy is important for humans in domestication is because we kind of put ourselves at the top of that hierarchy. So if I can control the alpha of that herd, then all of the other animals are going to follow. You know, back like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, out west in the United States, people would do these cattle drives where they would take huge herds of cattle, like 1,000 cattle at one time, and they would take them on horseback from Texas to Montana, let's say. And you would only have a couple cowboys in charge of 1,000 cows. Well, how are a couple cowboys going to make sure that 1,000 cows all get to the same place together? Well, you don't have to have control over all 1,000 of them. You only have to have control over the few leaders in the group, because as long as they follow you, the rest of the cows will follow them. Also, if you've seen like the dog whisperer, Cesar Millan, he talks about how you, like with dogs, you put yourself at the top as the pack leader. That's exactly what we're talking about. You just have to be in charge of the animal in charge, and that's how you maintain control over the entire group. This is important for pastoralists because they are moving around these large herds of animals throughout the year. And that is also their form of wealth, right? They're nomadic because these herbivores have to eat throughout the year. And if you've got 1,000 sheep, you're probably not going to have land right around your house that's going to have enough grass for 1,000 sheep to eat all year long. So pastoralists will be nomadic. Pastoralists use the resources of the animals that they herd in different ways. There are things called primary resources and secondary resources. Primary resources are the meat of the animal or the blood of the animal. Secondary resources are their labor, like some animals can carry things or pull things, or their milk would be a secondary resource, or their wool, right? You can shave them and get the wool and make clothing or rope or whatever. So primary resources are the direct body of the animal that in order to harvest it, you kind of have to kill the animal. Secondary resources are things that aren't going to kill the animal that can still be beneficial to you as a human. Pastoralists will use secondary resources more often than primary resources, because secondary resources are replenishable. If I milk a goat today, I can milk it tomorrow, and I can milk it the next day. If I kill a goat today, I can't kill it again tomorrow. So using secondary resources is going to be more important in those communities. And then there's also another way that we see pastoralists organizing their group life, and that's something called transhumance. So let me just erase my little thing, because I love this word so much. I honestly don't know why I love this word, but I just do. So we're going to write it down. Okay. Transhumance. That's an N. Here. Is that right? Transhumance. This means that part of the group is nomadic and part of the group is sedentary. So think of it like this. Let's say you've got a village, right? But you've also got all these animals. So basically throughout the year, you're going to have half of the group moving around with the animals in a nomadic sort of rotation. And then the other half of the group is going to stay put in the village. The half that's staying put, that's going to be, the women. There she is wearing a skirt. So women, children, and the elderly. And then the half that's on their rotation, that's going to be the men, right? That seems to make some sense, especially what we know about traditional gender roles in various communities. That's called transhumance. Okay, what have I missed? Let me see. I'm going to look at my study guide just to make sure that I got most of the points. So we talked, I'm literally reading off the list here. Horticulture, done. Slash and burn, done. Last glacial maximum, did it. Broad spectrum revolution, I didn't talk about that, but that's the broad spectrum revolution refers to that time, like 13,000 years ago, when the foragers were living in that area of the Middle East, and there's all these different food and animal resources. What we see happen when suddenly there's this abundance of food is that humans really vary their diet. They go from focusing on a couple plants or a couple animals into I'm gonna eat everything, right? So that's what we mean when we say the broad spectrum revolution. That spectrum refers to a food spectrum, the buffet spectrum. And it's this change in human behavior where we see them eating more types of foods. They're eating more, more fish, more like turtles, birds, not just the big land animal that you hunt with a bow and arrow. We talked about the environmental zones in the Middle East, the high plateau, the hilly flanks, the Piedmont steppe, the alluvial desert. We talked about sedentism. It's the opposite of nomadism. I mentioned the Natufians, this one of those groups of sedentary hunter-gatherers in the Middle East. We discussed the difference between wild and domesticated plants. Let me refine that. Wild plants, these are the ones that have adapted through natural selection. The seeds are often smaller. They have harder shells on them so that if animals eat them, they're protected from like the digestive digestive, fluids of an animal's stomach. And then the animals defecate them out, and then that's how the plants grow. So wild plants are adapted for being in the wild without human intervention. Domesticated plants, because humans have interjected ourselves in their sort of evolutionary history, seeds are bigger, they're easier to process, they're easier to collect. For animals, domesticated animals are bigger. Domesticated animals are more chill. Like, we were able to have this symbiotic relationship. Like I give, you give, a little bit of back and forth. Sorry for the street traffic. A couple motorcycles. Okay, next on the list, independent innovation of domestication. That is a very wordy phrase. What that means is that although farming and horticulture first appears in the Middle East, 10,000, 12,000 years ago, we see other groups of humans coming up with a similar solution to similar problems at various places around the world throughout history. Sometimes people like to look at a place like the Middle East and say, well, here were the first farmers. So Farmers in Mexico, they must have learned about it from the Middle East. Farmers in China must have learned about it from the Middle East. So clearly we've got these Middle Eastern farmers who are spreading out throughout the world and taking with them their secrets of farming, their secrets of the ancient world. No, it's not necessary. We see farming first develop in the Middle East 10, 12,000 years ago. We also see farming develop for the first time in Mexico about 5,000 years ago, and for the first time in China 5,000 years ago, and for the first time in Africa 3,000 years ago, and for the first time in Peru 5,000 years ago. So at all of these different times and places in human history, humans invented a similar solution to a similar problem. It doesn't mean those communities were connected, and it certainly doesn't mean that aliens came down and told them how to do it. It just means humans are really good at figuring out problems, and that means sometimes we come up with the same solution. Okay, we talked about agriculture, we talked about irrigation and terracing, talked about pastoralism, nomadism, and transhumance. So can we answer these questions? What is the definition of horticulture? We can do that. What specific practices do horticulturalists use? Cool, slash and burn and letting fields lie fallow. Definition of agriculture, big scale farming with labor and money and machinery. What practices do they use in their management of farmland? Irrigation and terracing. We're golden. What are the characteristics of wild and domesticated plants? We just talked about this. What causes a plant to become domesticated? Humans interjecting themselves in that system, selecting for the best characteristics, right? Like if you think that, like, okay, what could really be the difference between a wild plant and a domesticated plant? Look up wild bananas. They're completely unlike the bananas that we eat today, right? They're tiny, they're full of seeds. It would have been a real chore to eat them. The 4 environmental zones of the Middle East, yeah, I know what those 4 are. The high plateau, right? High plateau, hilly flanks, Piedmont steppe, alluvial desert. What foragers first settled in the Middle East? Easy, the Natufians. What area did they settle in? The hilly flanks. What made it possible for them to settle there? There was so much food, they didn't have to be nomadic anymore. Where did they go after that? They went to the Piedmont steppe and started farming. And look at that. We just went through the whole study guide related to cultivation. So yeah, there's that. That's how I would kind of approach this. I spent a long time talking about a lot of stuff, but don't let the length of this study guide overwhelm you. These terms fit into the review questions that are in there, so don't think of them as independent, okay? All right, my friends, that's all I wanted to say about cultivation today. But I'm wondering if you have any questions about any of this or any other material from Unit 3, pop them in the chat field and I'll answer them before we sign off for today. Or if you are still kind of thinking about what your questions might be, remember we're doing another one of these tomorrow night at 6. And in my emails too, I let you know the times for various YouTube reviews. And we've also got our online office hours, and you're welcome to pop in there or email me if you have any questions, and I will answer them in one format or another. So if you have a question, drop it in the chat box now. But otherwise, I'm probably going to sign off. I feel like we're on the quieter side of things. I do appreciate all of you who watch this. I mean, I was going to do it anyway, but it's always nice to see when people are, there with you, so it doesn't feel like you're speaking just into the space, into ether. All right. Well, let me make sure I'm not missing something on my phone. Sometimes that happens. I can see myself looking at my phone on my thing. Okay, cool. All right, my friends, I think I'm going to probably sign off then for now. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their Sunday. If you're in New York, seriously, if you can, get outside, get some sunlight, get some fresh air while still doing all of the safety things that we all still need to be doing. I see a quick, can you make a template so I can give some advice to my teacher on how to run an online class? Whew, that's dipping a toe into dangerous waters, perhaps, Noah. There's this whole transition to online. Most of us, in the States, we've been doing online work for a couple months now. It's been a difficult transition for everyone. So, trying to give your credit to your teacher. I'm sure they're doing what they can. There are a lot of resources available though online. So I might not give you exactly what you're looking for here, Noah. But yeah, I don't. Yeah, I wouldn't know what to say about how to run a class online. The nice thing about my classes is, it's a really good community of people. And I am very lucky to have a really great community of students to work with. So not to say that your teacher doesn't. I'm sure you're wonderful too. Yeah, but Noah, you can, look through my other videos. Those are basically my lectures. And if any of that is useful, please use them freely with my blessing. Okay, guys, I'm going to sign off. And yeah, have a great day. Stay well, stay safe. And I'll be back here tomorrow at 6 p.m. for anyone who wants to join in. Okay? All right. Have a good one.